and happy July. Welcome to the Hockey Podcast, or as I'm looking out my window here in Vancouver, it feels like January. It's cold, very cold here. Anyway, you can follow us on Twitter at podcast_hockey, like us on Facebook, The Hockey Podcast, subscribe on iTunes and Spotify. And as we are getting, hopefully, I'm touching wood, my head, as we are getting ramped up here, we're going to be, we're excited to have our guest, the Pinder half, on his Twitter, it says the Pinder half of Pinder and Steinberg, and apparently the least photogenic human alive. I don't know, Mr. Steinberg, if that is true, but Pat Steinberg from Fan 960, Sportsnet 960, is with us. Hello, how are you?
I'm good, Kev. It's good to be on. I'm glad to be talking some hockey. Hopefully that's something we're doing on a more regular basis here and not just speculating like we have been for the last 4 months. So it's good to be on.
Yeah, it's like a 4-month trade rumor. It'll be so nice. I mean, like, we won't talk about it now, but like, it's getting so crazy that Jake Vertanen appearing at a bar is creating controversy here in Vancouver. So I think we need to talk about hockey more, I guess, right? When it gets that bad. But for the last 3-4 months, kind of tell us what's been like for you, like since the middle of March. What's it been like at 960? What have been some of your challenges, and how have you guys been doing over there? And how have you been doing as well?
Well, I mean, it's been like for everybody. I think it's kind of a universal thing when people say that, yeah, it's been weird, and then the automatic caveat is, everybody can relate to just how weird it's been. It's been a weird time in sports radio. I mean, our industry is so based on live events and is so reliant on live events that when you go from, I mean, let's be perfectly honest, March, April, May, those are some of the best days, one of the best times in sports radio in this country, because you're talking about the opportunity to have the start of baseball, playoffs in hockey and basketball. The CFL season is starting. I mean, it really is a great time. The only other time that is like the spring is the fall, when you're into the start of the basketball and the hockey playoffs, and then you've got baseball. Sorry, the start of the seasons in basketball and hockey. Then you got the baseball playoffs and the NFL starting. Like, those are the two best times to be in sports radio. And then all of a sudden you've got nothing, and you're talking about nothing. And for the first 2 months, I mean, doing a 4-hour talk show, a 4-hour sports talk show, you had, not only did you have nothing to talk about in terms of topics given to you, but you also had no certainty. Like, it was so gray, and everything was so up in the air. And every time you talked about the potential of the NHL returning, or every time you talked about something happening a little further down the line, it was always based on this, well, yeah, it could happen, but we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone what's going to happen in 2 or 3 months' time. So it's been difficult. It's been better of late. I mean, there's definitely been more to talk about since, I want to say, the beginning of May. The NHL made their big announcement in May, where they gave some preliminary details on how they're planning on returning to play. And there's been this whole saga with baseball and the mess that they got themselves into, and the NBA, and then finalizing their bubble in Orlando. So it's been a whole lot better of late. There's no doubt. So that's been good. And it's been good to have actual sports to talk about. And now that we know that the Flames are playing the Jets and all that type of stuff, there's definitely more to talk about. So I'm good. The job's been different. I think it's been a good growing experience. I think that for a lot of people in sports radio, it'll just make all of us better broadcasters, because it's a challenge and it makes you do something much different and step out of your comfort zone. But I will say, yes, do I think in the long run it'll make me a better broadcaster? For sure. Am I ready to get back to normal? 100%. So I'm really excited for the I guess, pending return of hockey. It's going to be a fun summer. Fingers crossed everything goes according to plan.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Just before we get into that, though, what was some of the strangest stuff that you guys talked about the last 4 months?
Oh, man. we we were talking about. It was more for the first month and a half. It was as much about just our lives and that type of stuff as it was about actual sports talk. It turned into a sharing session, and we, you talk about what you did, what you watched on TV. Those are the things that were more frequent in the first little bit, just because there was nothing to talk about. And we talk about that stuff regardless. It's part of what we do, but we're still at the core a station that and a format that relies on sports. So, we would talk about, like, I remember it honestly feels like eons ago, but remember the Tiger King? That was a massive conversation topic for a couple of weeks. Or Ozark was a huge conversation topic. Or what you were drinking and how much you consumed. Those became massive topics because I think for a lot of people, it wasn't necessarily the healthiest, but for a lot of people, perhaps the alcohol consumption went up, especially at the beginning of everything. So those are some of the things that we talked about. We got a segment that we do on the radio station called Wild Card Wednesday, where we kind of, we talk about things and we ask questions that are a little more off the beaten path compared to what we're usually talking about. So those got a little bit weird and a little bit uncomfortable in a good way. So, yeah, I mean, it was fun. And I definitely, I'll say this, had I not had the radio station and the radio show to be able to kind of almost rely on for a little bit of normalcy, as much as you're working from home for a good chunk of it and it really wasn't normal, you still had the show and you still had that thing that you knew was going to be there every day for 4 hours of your day, which I think I was lucky. I didn't end up losing my job or going on temporary furlough or anything like that. And so many people did have to and are continuing to have to do that right now. I got pretty lucky in that respect. And that was the biggest reason why I felt so lucky, because it gave you that. It was kind of like work turned into your escape, because the rest of what was going on was nowhere near as fun. So, we had some weird conversations, some fun conversations, but in the end, it was good to be able to talk to somebody for 4 hours a day and be able to have something to rely on 4 hours a day. That was probably the best part of all.
Right. Yeah. The therapy of just getting through this, for sure.
Exactly.
And I think people appreciated the radio more just because, there was so much, especially at the beginning, it was so much COVID, so much like we didn't know what was going on. I think people needed the break just to get away from COVID conversation.
And that's what we were trying to do. I think, as much as we talked about the return and as much as we talked about, where Alberta's testing numbers were and case numbers were. And, when April was kind of I think it was late April, was kind of the first day where there was some positive news and kind of it felt like there was some forward momentum when the announcement of Alberta's kind of return or reopening strategy were announced. That was a big day, but we tried more than anything else and I know that the other show on our station, our morning show, had a very similar approach, just trying to maybe give a little bit of a reprieve from the inundated nature of COVID. And it was a serious situation, and you don't want to take away from how serious it is. You don't want to take away from the fact that people are in serious peril and losing their jobs, and family members are losing their lives, and it was a very serious situation. But we wanted to, while still absolutely acknowledging how serious the situation was and how important adhering to all of the different restrictions was, we also wanted to give a little bit of a distraction so that people, even if they tuned in for 4 or 5 minutes, wouldn't have to hear the same stuff they were hearing on the news every day. That was one of our big focuses. And so I hope we did a good job with that. And I hope that we were able to, for some people, give a little bit of a distraction or a little bit of an escape, because that's what sports does. When sports exists, that's what sports is supposed to be. And part of maybe the biggest frustrating part for sports fans during all this is that the world was an absolute mess, and there was not a whole lot positive going on in the early stages, And we didn't have those games to escape to. Like the real world sucks for everybody at different times. But usually if you're a sports fan, you got your favorite team's game, or you can turn on a live game or something like that. That didn't exist. And really didn't exist for a couple of months until some of the first sports started to return. So, yeah, I hope that we were able to do a little bit of that and add a little bit of a distraction. That was our intent anyway.
Okay, cool. I'm sure you did. I know you did. Because you do it all the time. So, and you are one of the most patient people on the radio as well. So, with how overtime and all of that, and I'm sure you're looking forward to hearing from that and all of those as well. So, basically, in terms of how are you looking at? It's fascinating because we're seeing, you mentioned Major League Baseball, and the Blue Jays got permission to do, air quoting, spring training in Toronto. Baseball's still a mess. I don't really know what's going on. NBA's continuing to go in Orlando. MLS seems to be in a really interesting situation. I know that the Whitecaps are not leaving for Orlando as an example yet, and they may not leave this weekend. So in terms of bringing us, I guess, big picture sports, but then specifically where the NHL is at, do you feel that the NHL is in good shape right now, or is this all what you're seeing giving you pause for concern?
I think that I've been very optimistic from the get-go, and I have gone out of my way to be optimistic just for my own mental health. It's been really important to be outwardly optimistic about the chance for the NHL to return and what it might look like, and not to say, because I know, and everybody is entitled to their own opinion, and especially in something like this, everybody's opinion is as valid as the next, and so I know there are some who believe that a return is too dangerous, or it doesn't make sense right now. And what is the NHL even thinking? We're in the midst of a worldwide pandemic. Like I understand all those things, and while I don't necessarily agree 100%, I don't think that any of that thinking is invalid or misplaced. I think there's absolutely valid arguments for the restart on both sides of this thing. But I'm feeling pretty good about where things are right now. I am. I like the fact that the NHL has maybe smartened up is the best way of putting it, and determined that if the safety of the athletes and the safety of everybody involved in a return to play is going to be paramount, which it should be, that holding it anywhere but in Canada doesn't really make sense. So them deciding to move away from Las Vegas and determining that places like Vancouver, which we know will not be a hub city, and Edmonton and Toronto, which will be hub cities, determining that those are the best places to go, I think was a real step forward in terms of my overall optimism. And I feel like it's a worthy task to undertake for them to try to return, knowing that by no means is a guarantee that it's going to be successful, and there's a lot of different hurdles they still have to clear even now that we're talking about, theoretically and most likely, I think, games resuming in less than a month's time from when we're recording this. So yeah, I'm feeling pretty good about things. I think the NHL is being very, very careful, and making sure that they're not screwing around with this thing. And they are, I believe, everything that I have read, everything that I have been led to believe from people I trust, and just everything that every indication you get is that the NHL is putting health and safety first and foremost, and making sure that the players are going to be able to return, and the league is going to be able to return and recoup some of the lost revenue that they've lost here since the beginning of March, or since the middle of March. And so I do think it's going to happen, and I think it's going to be strange. I believe it's going to be the weirdest time that we've ever watched, and for people like you and I, we've ever covered hockey or been in the media and covering hockey. So it's gonna be weird, but I think it's important if they can get back and hand out a Stanley Cup and be able to squeeze in a couple of months of action here and be able to do so in a safe fashion, then I say, yeah, you might as well go down that road. So I like the way things are trending. I like the fact that the NHL has prioritized having their hubs in Canada where it just made the most sense from a safety perspective. And now I'm really interested to see what this looks like when they drop the puck here. And we're thinking that's going to be in late July or early August.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it should have. I always felt Edmonton was the best option. Even then, even though BC's numbers were so low, it just made sense. Edmonton, the way that it's structured, seemed to make sense to me, and I think what they're doing in Toronto, I think, will work. I guess, what have you had a chance to hear from any players about any concerns on your end? I mean, I know that there's been a number of people saying that there are players that are concerned. What have you had a chance to talk to any players yourself, or what is?
I have, and we've had the Calgary Flames have been very good to us throughout all this. They've been very accommodating and trying to help us with. They know as well as anybody that we're kind of hurting for content, so they've been really good in that regard. And yeah, I've heard from players and look, there's absolutely, I think there is understandable concern throughout all of this, and it's fair for players to be concerned. But everything that I have, most of what I've heard is that if this can be done safely, if this can be done in an equitable fashion when it comes to agreeing on some new principles in the collective bargaining agreement, the most players I've talked to, I don't know, 10 or 11 different members of the Calgary Flames, and they're feeling like that if this can be safely done, they're willing to make the sacrifices and eager to make the sacrifices that they're going to be asked to make this happen. Now, that's all publicly, and that's all done on interviews that are being listened to on the radio. So I don't know if players are going to come out 100% and say that they're not comfortable with A or B. So, and I can understand that because you don't want to necessarily put yourself in the news cycle if you don't have to. But I think that for the most part, everybody that I've talked to is wanting to return. And yeah, we're talking about millions of dollars, and there's a big time financial component to why the NHL is so dialed into trying to return. But I also think from a player's standpoint, like these are guys that are wired to be competitive. These are guys that are wired to want to win games. And just take a look at it from the perspective in this city. In Calgary, this was a team that was in the midst of a playoff race and then all of a sudden had that taken right away from them. And that was no different than the Vancouver Canucks where you are, or any of the other teams that were in playoff races. The St. Louis Blues had this feel that they had a great chance of repeating as Stanley Cup champions, and I think a lot of other people agreed. The Colorado Avalanche felt like here was this team that had made so many strides 1 year ago and had continued the strides this season, and they felt they had real eyes on making a long run in the playoffs. So all these guys, I think, ideally would like to return. I don't think that any guy would say they don't want to finish the season if they can't. It just comes down to the actual health and safety and whether or not this can be done in a sensible manner. And for the longest time, we didn't know if that could be done. Like we had no idea if actually returning and playing hockey again this season was going to be something that could happen realistically. Now that we know it can, and now we know that every league in North America is going out of their way to either start their season or finish their season, I think it's a little bit more realistic and you don't need to squint as hard to see it. So yeah, I don't discount any of the concerns that are out there from NHL players. Much like any other person, this is a real personal thing, the way that you handle with living in a kind of once in a lifetime pandemic. Mm-hmm. But I do think that by and large, players are going to be excited to play when they return, or at least the ones that I've talked to. That's the feeling that I've gotten, and yeah, I don't think that there are guys who have. Like, I don't think that guys don't have any concerns, and I don't think that we're talking about players who are just saying, "Nope, doesn't matter. Let's play. Doesn't matter what happens, and we'll just do whatever." But I do think that most are feeling pretty comfortable about the way the NHL is going about this, at least the ones that I've spoken to.
That's fair. But the one I was just thinking about that, and the one that I was concerned about, I'm wondering about, is TJ Brody, because he had he had that. I was wondering about him. Not like I could see if there was anyone on the Flames that I could see maybe could be a no that we know of. I was wondering about if he may not be, but again, I guess we'll find out.
Well, and even if he does, I don't think that anybody should be upset or there should be any criticism levied toward him. Like if you're an NHL player and you don't feel safe enough to return, or you just feel like it's in better interest for your family to return when the entire world situation is a little bit better, then I think that every player should be should be allowed to have those feelings. And I believe this can be done safely. I believe this will be done safely. But at the same time, that's just me. A, I'm not playing, and B, that's my opinion. And there are so many differing opinions that are out there on this thing that I don't think there is necessarily a cut and dried right answer. This is going to be presented to the players. It's not just going to be a vote that is happening just from the representatives. This is absolutely going to be a scenario where the entire membership of the NHLPA is asked their opinion, and the vote will happen on the 700 plus members of the NHLPA. So players are going to be able to have their voice heard. And I believe the NHL will have things available where if a player does not feel comfortable, there's not going to be any penalty for them not returning to play. Much like what the NBA's had, we've seen in Major League Baseball, players have decided to opt out of their return to play protocols. Like it's a real personal thing. We're never gonna, as a sports league, as people who cover this sport and who love this sport, I don't think we're ever going to cover or be a part of anything like this again. So, that's why this is, the word unprecedented is thrown around as much as this, but it truly is. I don't think we're ever going to be talking about something quite like this again. So if a player decides that for a little bit of time they're just not comfortable, I completely understand why, and I don't think that they should be shamed or feel like they have to return if they really don't feel comfortable in returning. And I hope that that's what we're going to be talking about when it's all said and done. I believe it is what we're going to be talking about when it's all said and done. But Brody is in the city and taking part in the on-ice sessions, I believe. And I don't know how he's feeling personally, but from everything that I've led to believe is that if and when that vote is going to happen, that most players on the Flames are excited to return and excited to see what this season is going to be about. But that he would be one that would come to mind, and because of the health issue that he had a little earlier this year, and maybe there are other guys who just feel they have immunocompromised people in their family, a son or a daughter, a wife or a parent or something like that, where they feel like it's not, they don't feel comfortable in doing it. All the power to them if that's what they end up deciding. And I really hope that because I think inevitably there are going to be guys who decide that they're just not comfortable doing that. If and when that happens, I hope there isn't going to be criticism on social media of those players, because it is 100% their call, and they should be embraced regardless of what way they decide to go on this particular issue.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I totally agree with you. Before we move into what could happen, like in terms of the playoff matchup and where the Flames are at going into this camp, it is important to look back. This year, we had the TJ Brody situation. We had Bill Peters and Jeff Ward and the coaching change. And then we had Matthew Tkachuk versus Zach Kassian, which was exhausting. And then the David Rittich stick flip controversy. Did I miss anything?
Oh, well, I mean, on top of the fact they were having an extremely inconsistent season before, but like it was a year where you just didn't know what to expect from the Flames in any given night too. So all of that combined, it has been well. And let's not forget they found out that assistant general manager Chris Snow is dealing with ALS, and that happened. That they found out just before the season started. But that's another thing that they've been dealing with and has been weighing heavily on them throughout. It's been an extremely on one of the first conference calls that GM Brad Treliving has had with the media, and I I really do give Brad a ton of credit for all the things that you can criticize a general manager about, and a GM deserves criticism. That's part of what goes along with the territory. But the one thing that he is not is unaccommodating with the Calgary media. He's been unbelievable during this thing. The entire team has, and so he's been doing these pretty much weekly conference calls since the beginning of April. And so I think on the first one, Ryan Leslie of Sportsnet asked him, hey, Brad, if you had one word for the 2019-20 season, what would it be? And Brad just said, uncle, because it has been like as tumultuous and as up and down a roller coaster ride as I can ever remember. And that was before the pandemic hit. And that was just another strange twist on what has been a bizarre season. So, yeah, it's been, I don't think you missed anything there. I think you got everything.
So, yeah, I forgot about Snowy. I was going to ask you about that too. But I guess from an organizational sense, where is the organization now? Do you look at this as a growth moment, or was this an uncle moment and a blip, or will we have to wait and see?
In terms of what?
Like all of this turmoil, has it changed the organization? Did you feel like this organization has grown from it? It's not even like there was any mistakes made. I mean, it's just stuff that happened. I mean, other than the Bill Peters situation, there wasn't anything that really, wasn't really, I'm using an air quote, a mistake being made. I mean, there was so much attention being put on the Flames this year that I wonder, as an organization, do you feel that it grew the organization, changed the organization in any way?
I don't know yet. And I think so much of this season was going to be really based on what they did after the regular season ended, what they did in the playoffs, because so much reason, or a big part of the reason why there was a lot of attention on the Flames, not just like there was attention there prior to the Bill Peters situation, was because they had such a great year one season ago, and was because they won the President's Trophy, or rather won the Western Conference, and were second in the President's Trophy race, and had such a great regular season year, and then got rolled by an 8th seed in the first round of the playoffs. And so there was such a spotlight on them coming into the year, specifically in the market. There was a huge spotlight because the question was, can this core group of players get the job done in the playoffs, or is it time to start thinking about different ways to build the team and different players to build the team around? And so then all of the turmoil happened, and they were disappointing out the gates. And then Bill Peters gets fired, or I guess technically the two teams went their separate ways. And then all of a sudden they start to resurge, and they make a couple of moves at the deadline. And next thing you know, we're talking about a worldwide pandemic that has stalled everything. They were technically in a playoff spot, but we had no idea how the rest of the season was going to go had there not been a 5-month pause when it's all said and done. So it's weird, and it's almost like, I believe, and others might look at it differently. I'd be curious the way you look at it too. Like, I believe going into this year, I was using this season, and specifically what they did in the playoffs, as a big-time litmus test and a big-time kind of evaluation of this core group of players. Like, if this team were to, A, miss the playoffs, or B, have another disappointing performance in the playoffs, and the key players that had been under the microscope were disappointing once again, well, maybe it is time to go in a different direction. Maybe it is time for Brad Treliving to start looking at different ways, or a different core to build around. But now that there's been this 5-month pause, I don't know. I really don't. I don't know how to look at that anymore. I almost wonder if that conversation needs to be put on pause. You know what I'm saying? Like, I almost wonder if you have to say, well, this is the craziest year that we've ever seen in the NHL. Maybe having this referendum on the core group of players, that's not the best time to do it anymore. So I'd be curious to what you think, because that's what I believed we were talking about. But the world has changed dramatically since the last time we were actually talking about hockey being played on the ice. And you're coming back after 5 months and playing a best-of-5 play-in series where anything can happen. I don't know if you can make that your sole evaluator. I wonder if that referendum, or making those big decisions on Monahan and Gaudreau and other players like that might wait a little bit.
I think it's going to have a lot to do with how the play-ins go and how like one of my, I don't know if this is going to be true or not, but I'm wondering if this is almost this empty arena scenario benefits a Monahan and a Gaudreau more than a Kachuk in a sense, because they're not necessarily going to be fueled by the intensity of the crowd. They can just play their game, where I think the playoffs seems to be a bit of a different animal, and intensity for Gaudreau, and it's sometimes like I think so, like it's been my opinion when it's been a big game, Johnny Gaudreau has disappeared, but I wonder now with sort of the weight lifted off his shoulders, empty arena, he can just focus on playing hockey, that I wonder if this is going to be a benefit. But it really is going to go down if they get blown out by the Jets. I think you have to look at some changes. But if you even lose in 5, I think that, I don't know. I look at the Flames and the Jets as a fairly even matchup. I mean, the biggest edge may be goaltending. We'll talk about that in a bit, but I think I can see your point, but it really is going to depend on how they do in the play-ins.
I guess I just worry that, I don't know, they come back and they do lose to the Jets, and it is an uninspiring fashion. But I wonder how much of that can be put on the actual. It's just because it's so different, and we've never seen anything like this before, and to judge a player that was at one time viewed as a core piece for the next 10, 15 years, to make a final decision based on 3 or 4 games potentially after 5 months off.
Yeah.
I just don't know if that's the most prudent way of going about things. And maybe I'm being naive. Maybe some of these decisions were almost already made, and maybe this will just be a confirmation one way or the other. I don't know. I just wonder if you might look at it and say, okay, yes, that's disappointing, and we're not going to ignore it, but we're also not going to make our final determination based on this, like maybe they would have had the season finished under more regular circumstances. I don't know, because it's so weird. We've never seen anything like this before, Kev. Like a year that has a 5-month pause in the middle of it, and I just don't know how or what metrics you use to actually judge a team or judge a player's success after so much time off. Maybe it's the exact same metrics that you always use. Maybe nothing changes. But I just from the outside, I wonder that I personally wouldn't be putting the same type of stock into the 2020 postseason as I did into the 2019 postseason, because it is so drastically different. I'm curious as to how the Flames view that. If they look at it more like you do, that, you know what, if we go out, it doesn't really matter. Like, we needed to have a good showing here regardless, or if they're looking at it more of a, because it is so different, maybe they'll put a pause on things. I'm not saying I'm right or you're wrong. I'm fascinated by the whole thing as to how the team is going to look at this.
Because, well, you can look at, I can see growth, and I do, like, with Monahan specifically, I know that he didn't have that great of a year, and he was as inconsistent as everybody, and I still am not, honestly, still not convinced he's a number one center, but I think I'm seeing maybe saw some possible playoff Sean Monahan coming out, where he was playing with a little bit more intensity. Again, I do see your point, though. If we're going to have that same intensity, I don't know. And I maybe saw a little bit of a chip on the shoulder with Johnny Gaudreau, but two, I guess the question is what is that chip? Is he just frustrated with the way he's playing, or is he trying to channel that frustration into being more of a playoff performer, if that makes sense?
Well, and I think your point's an interesting one about, what is the intensity going to look like in empty arena games to compete for a Stanley Cup? Like, so much of what the postseason is based on the atmosphere in buildings, and now all of a sudden there's going to be no atmosphere in buildings. So how does that change an individual player, and how does that make a player more or less effective or hide potentially hide or potentially make worse some of the flaws in an individual player's game. That's a fascinating thing that we're going to find out and hypothesize on, but really have no idea on until we're actually watching these games. And it's interesting because it works both ways, doesn't it? Like, for my argument in saying that, well, maybe you don't want to put too much stock into it. Maybe you don't put too much stock into it the other way. Like, all of a sudden say that Johnny and Monahan have really good postseasons, and like, how much stock can you put into that? Is that really 100% growth, or is that a product of things being completely different? I just think you have to, at least in some form or another, I think that teams, and especially teams that are facing a crossroads like the Flames are, I think they have to take this and take all of what happens with at least somewhat of a grain of salt. And that's why I'm really curious as to some of the final decisions that may or may not get made once this season comes to an end.
Yeah, it is going to be interesting. And I mean, with what, I mean, now it's 70% of the salary cap is another significant thing that you're going to have to look at, that it's not going to be that easy to trade a Johnny Gaudreau for the value that you think he's worth, or a Sean Monahan. It might be worth, even if it is a terrible playoff, play it through and see what happens. I mean, I was assuming, one of the things I was assuming is Milan Lucic would be an easy buyout for next year, but that's not necessarily as easy to do now, is it?
No, and I mean, so much of what the Flames so much of what they were planning to do this offseason, and they're not unlike any other team who they're all in similar situations, except for the ones that don't really have cap crunches. But the Flames were going to be in a cap crunch and have some difficult decisions to make to begin with, and now gonna have that many more. There's so many interesting things about this. Like, I've wondered out loud many times about if I'm a TJ Brody or if I'm a Travis Hamonic, pending unrestricted free agents who are fairly tenured now as member of the Flames, specifically on the Brody front, but even Hamonic's been here a little while now. And so if you're them, you're entering free agency and you've got the opportunity to maybe get this big payday, the last opportunity for both guys, I think, to really get that big fat contract. But I wonder if that contract exists in a pandemic free agency world. If we're all expecting free agency to begin on November 1st, which sure does feel like it's going to. So Are you feeling like you're all of a sudden going to have a ton of bargaining power in that free agent atmosphere, that free agent environment, knowing that the cap is not going to go up? That's A. And then B, how comfortable are you in a completely uncharted situation coming back to play without a contract? Like, if you're just, let's say Hamonic, for instance, Travis Hamonic has definitely, because of the way that he plays, he has been injury prone throughout his career. I think he's never played more than like 72 games in an NHL season, I believe. I'm just going to quickly look it up right now just to make sure that I'm accurate. Yeah, never played more than 74 games in an NHL season. He's missed at least 8 games every season. And I don't think he's injury prone because of any other reason than he just plays such an absolutely hard-nosed, sacrifice everything type of game that it just lends itself to a guy getting injured because he sells out every single time he's out there. And so if you're him and you know that injuries have been more frequent in your career than other guys, how comfortable are you with going back to this return to play, going back into the intensity of the playoffs, and having not played for 5 months where there's already concern that there might be added risk of injury? Like, are you willing to go back there and play without a contract for next season? And would that maybe make it more likely that a guy like him would just sign a 1-year deal? Hey, I want to sign for this year. I want to make sure that I've got a contract. I want to go into next season with a contract, and then I can try free agency again. I wonder how many guys, whether it be on the Flames or in other markets across the league in similar situations, think about doing that just so they have a little bit of certainty and they have a little bit of peace of mind. There's so much, because you talk about it from a a Gaudreau Monahan standpoint and how it might be more difficult to trade those guys. I think you're right because of the cap situation that we're going to be living in starting next season. And I think there's just so many of the cap things that we're used to are going to be different. I'm fascinated to see how it all plays out and how many other things are going to be different when we get to November.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I never really, you made the point about Hammond. I never thought about what Hamonic would do, but you're right. It's, that's such an interesting situation. And even with him and Hanifin, and I don't know where you're at with Hanifin, but I mean, a lot of people were suggesting he's a guy that they need to move. And it is a fascinating situation when you look at we don't know what Valimaki is yet. We have an idea that he is a high prospect, but he's also coming off a pretty major injury, and you want to be careful one way or the other with him, how you use him, which I'll be curious your thoughts there. But where are you on Hanifin as well? Is this a guy that you think, another guy you think that deserves a shot that just hasn't found his fit yet, or did we have high expectations for him?
Noah Hanifin's 23 years old. Is he a perfect defenseman? No. Do I see him turning into an elite NHL defenseman, a guy that you build your blue line around? No, I'll be honest, I don't see that. But he's still a bona fide top 4 NHLer. He's still a guy that can play 20 to 25 minutes a night. He is a very strong skater, as we know. And I'll give the guy a lot of credit. Does he have his flaws in his games? Absolutely. Are there some things that are frustrating on the defensive side of things with Hanifin? For sure there are. But at under $5 million for the next 4 years after this, and for a guy that can play in your top 4, and that he can be the same guy and give you the same type of hockey, whether he's playing 15 or 25 minutes, I still think there's a value in that. And especially to your point about Valimaki, where we still don't know what this guy is going to be. We all have high expectations, and I think justifiably have high expectations, but we still don't know what he's going to be. Having a guy like Hanifin at a very reasonable contract, a very tradable contract, I don't think the Flames need to be eager to be moving this guy out. I think that you just need to continue using him the way that he has been used. And as I was saying, I'll give the guy credit. He has gotten better every year he's played in the NHL. You go take a look at the underlying numbers. You go take a look at his defensive game and his overall game. It has taken strides each and every year. I don't think that it's ever going to get to the point where he takes strides, and now we're talking about him as a Norris Trophy candidate or anything like that. But I do think that we're talking about him as a guy that can be in this league and play a regular shift on a blue line and help you if you need him on the power play on a regular basis. I don't think we're ever talking about him being a power play quarterback, but the way he skates and his ability to keep pucks in at the blue line, I think that there is definitely some merit if you are in a pinch and need him on a second unit to put him there. I just think a guy at under $5 million who's at 23 years old and you have him signed for 4 more years after this season at that deal, it's a tradable contract when you're at a point where you just know that maybe he's a little more expendable at the point where Juuso Valimaki is bona fide, no questions asked, a top 4 defenseman in the NHL. Okay, maybe let's have this conversation. But right now, with Mark Giordano going to be 37 to start next season and the uncertainty around what Valimaki is going to be for this team, I think having a guy on the left side like Hanifin just makes sense. I wouldn't be moving him. I wouldn't be actively trying to move him. If you could, nobody's untouchable. If there's a deal that makes sense, then have at her. But for just the sake of moving him because you don't like what he's done the last little bit, I would disagree with that completely, because I think that he is a valuable part of this team, and specifically for the role he plays at the price he's at, I wouldn't be looking to actively move him for the sake of moving him. I'd want to wait and see on a few other things before I'd go down that road.
And what about, just to finish up with the defense here too, what about Gio and Gustafsson? Because there's some, Sean brought this up as an idea, but we're maybe using more Gustafsson on the number 1 power play, moving Gio to the second power play. Where are you on what the use of Gio coming up here?
Well, Gustafsson was getting some more time on that number 1 unit. how many games did he play? He only played like less than 10 games in his with the Flames after being acquired, but he was definitely getting some more time on the number one unit, and they want to use him that way. Like they want to use Gustafsson he played 7 games, had 3 points in 7 games. They wanted to use him as the power play quarterback, and they wanted to give him the opportunity to grow into that spot because of the way he skates, because of his offensive instincts. I mean, we're talking about a guy in last full season at 60 points off the blue line. So like they wanted to exploit that and see if they could use him with a very skilled group of players that they have on their number one unit. When you're talking about Tkachuk and Gaudreau and Lindholm and Monahan as the 4 forwards on your top unit, and then you put a guy like Gustafsson there, I do think the sky's the limit. So I do think, again, had the season continued as normal and we hadn't had this situation, then I think Gustafsson would have been seeing a ton of time on the number one unit, and they probably would have used him there more than Giordano in the final 12 games of the season because they know what Gio is. They know that Gio can do the job. You know, that helped them win a Norris Trophy last year, what he did on the number one power play unit. But because of the future of what it could be, Gio being 36, and at some point we are going to see a step back and him no longer be a guy that probably plays top pairing minutes in this league. You know, a guy like Gustafsson to step in and be that number one power play unit as a pending unrestricted free agent, why not give him a try? And specifically, why not give him a try and see what you've got prior to the playoffs, and then you can make a decision closer to postseason time. So no, I think that's fair, and I think that we're going to see him get that opportunity at different times once we drop the puck again. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the offseason with both him and Forbort, the 2 guys they acquired at the deadline. I think they'll try to re-sign Gustafsson, but I don't know that for sure. And I think that they'll try to bring back one of Hamonic or Brody if they can. But yeah, I would be in agreement. I'd like to see Gustafsson get some more time as that number one power play quarterback, because even a little bit of what we saw prior to the pause, there was some definite positives. And then there's the whole concept of whether Valimaki is going to play in the play-in round and once the return to play starts or not. That's a completely different conversation. I don't think he's going to. But
you don't think he's going to? Yeah, because if he plays, there is expansion options there, right?
Well, there's a few things there. Like there's the fact that, as we understand it, and Brad Treliving said this as of last week, he said the way they understand it is if Valimaki plays at all this season, and that includes in the return to play, that he will become eligible for the expansion draft. Whereas if he does not play this year, he will be exempt from the expansion draft. Now, my understanding has been all along that the medical advice the Flames have been given was to keep Valimaki out of competitive games for a calendar year. He got hurt around August 12th. I want to say it's probably closer to August 10th that the injury actually happened. But, somewhere in the second week of August 2019 is when Valimaki sustained his knee injury. And so calendar year would roughly put him the 1-year anniversary at right about when the first round of the playoffs would be theoretically starting. So there's the expansion draft there's the expansion draft things they have to think about and the considerations there, which I think are important. If you can have him exempt and now you're free to protect Hanifin and Anderson and another defenseman, whether it's Giordano or Brody or somebody else that you might acquire prior to the expansion draft, like it just gives you more flexibility. And I think that flexibility is important when you're talking about an expansion draft, but also like, I know that Valimaki stepped into game 4 and 5 of last year's postseason and did so very well. And that had been with a break of NHL action of more than 4 months. I'm well aware of that. However, the difference there was that he also got 20 games in the American League in. And he was also able to get back to speed after missing a bunch of time with a high ankle sprain. Here's a guy who will literally have not have played in like a year and a half almost, and now we're expecting him to jump right back into the playoffs. Empty arenas or not, we're expecting him to jump right back in. And the Flames have Gustafsson, and we've seen the emergence of Anderson. I just don't know if it makes a ton of sense for Valimaki to play for roster reasons, for health reasons, and for the expansion draft. Like everything to me seems like the most sensible thing would be to just not have him play and have him return next season. I know that's easier said than done, and maybe injuries happen and Valimaki is their best option, in which case all of this gets thrown out the window. But under ideal circumstances, I wouldn't be playing him, that's for sure.
Yeah, I can see. And then you still got, we haven't talked about Oliver Shillington yet either, but there's your fourth left defenseman, right? So, I mean, with Giordano, Hannif, and Gustafsson, Shillington, there's no real reason to play Valimaki.
Exactly. And when they go out and they get Gustafsson and Forbort at the trade deadline, like it just added more depth and less reason to go down that road and to force it with him. So I don't think they will. It's not impossible. And from a strictly physical standpoint, you might be able to make an argument that it could happen, but I just don't think it makes a ton of sense for them to do that. I really don't.
Yeah. I'll quickly ask you before we get into goaltending here, is Lindholm a center or a winger?
Well, for me or for them?
For you.
For me, I want to see him as a center full time. I think I'm with you on Sean Monahan. You said that a little earlier. Like, I don't believe Sean Monahan is or is going to be a bona fide number one center in this league. Like, he is. That is by no means a massive criticism on Sean Monahan. Monahan is a very good center iceman who can play the role as a number one center and can score you in his sleep 25 to 35 goals a year. Like, that is something that you covet on any team in the league. However, everything that I've seen from Monahan, and we're not talking about him in his sixth NHL season, right? Like, or is it his seventh NHL season? We're talking about Sean Monahan. Yeah, this is season number 7 for Monahan. Like, we're talking about him starting to move into is what he is territory in the league. You don't see 7 seasons in massive transformations from players. It's not impossible. It happens, but usually it doesn't. So I think what Monahan is a very offensively gifted scorer, a guy that easily scores 20 every year, is a threat for 30 every year too. He's a 3-time 30-goal scorer. Like, that's something you want on your team. But is he a guy that you can put out there in a playoff series for 7 straight games against Nathan McKinnon or Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl or Elias Pettersson or Tyler Seguin? I'm just like going down the list of other Western Conference centers. I don't think he's that guy. Whereas what I've seen from Lindholm suggests that he can be that guy. He can be that guy defensively. He can be that guy in a shutdown role. And he also has the offense at the other side. And I think while the numbers offensively, when Lindholm had that run for, it was about a month and a half, 2 months after Jeff Ward took over, when Lindholm had that run at center, perhaps the points weren't as gaudy as they were when he was playing on the right side of Johnny and Monahan. He was still putting up decent amount of points. He was still one of the higher scoring players on the team during that time. So, like, I think their best shot at a number one center is Elias Lindholm. And that is one area that I believe the Flames need if they ever want to truly get over the hump and be a Stanley Cup contender, is a true, no questions asked, all situations, unsheltered number one center. And I don't believe that is what Monahan is. If you could have Lindholm and Monahan as your 1A, 1B, or 1-2, then you are laughing. If you can have Lindholm and Tkachuk and Mangiapane playing in a all situations role against the top players on the other side, and then you can start to cater the ice time a little bit more for Monahan and Gaudreau, get them more offensive zone starts and get them a little bit lesser opposition, and still have a guy like Backlund taking on a lion's share of the defensive responsibility. Like, I think you're in a really good spot. I think that you can now play to Monahan and Gaudreau's strength even better, and you can use Lindholm to where I think he is at his most useful, and I think you've built yourself or constructed yourself a really good lineup, lines 1 through 4. They did that for a little bit. They reverted back to Lindholm on the right side in large part because Sean Monahan and Johnny Gaudreau went to Coach Ward and said, we'd like to have Lindholm back. And Michael Backlund went to Coach Ward and said, I'd like to move back to center, because he was playing wing for the longest time with Monahan and Gaudreau. And so I'd like to move back to the wing. I'd like to move back to center and move back with Tkachuk. And so they went about it that way. And so they made the change. and they reverted back to where they were before. But I believe Lindholm is best used long-term on this team as a center. I really do. And I hope they, at some point down the road, go down that road and use him that way. They did. They did for a long time and a longer stretch than I ever thought they were going to this season. But I think there's a lot to like there about it being a permanent fixture down the middle. What about you?
I'm with you. I think he's offensively gifted in terms of like Monahan and Gaudreau. That's a great line. But I'm thinking, you think about Winnipeg and you think about Mark Scheifele. I would love to say, I think Lindholm is a perfect match against him. I think he's all round. Some people bristle at the comparison, but it's a Patrice Bergeron style of player. I'm not saying he's Patrice Bergeron. I'm not saying that, but he can be that, and you don't necessarily need Patrice Bergeron and Brad Marchand and Pasternak don't, like, Bergeron and Marchand don't score a ton. Pasternak was the one that does a lot of it. And, you find offense other ways, and a lot of times it's by playing good defense. For me, if I'm preparing for the Jets, my absolute number one thing is I got to find a way to make sure Lindholm is with Scheifele any time that possibly can happen.
That's how I think they should use him too. And I think he is a defensive match for top centers in this league. And I think he can also dictate and get to work in the offensive zone too, which is what Bergeron, I don't think that's off base. Like, is he ever going to be at the level Patrice Bergeron has gotten to? I believe Patrice Bergeron for the last decade has been, the best two-way center, best all-round center in the league. Do I think he's the best center in the league? No, I think McDavid and Crosby are still there, but I put Bergeron at number 3, and I put him as the best two-way guy in the league where you can trust him in every situation to be elite. And I'm not saying that Lindholm is going to be to that level, but I can trust Lindholm at center against any matchup, in any zone, in any situation, protecting a lead or trailing by 2, whatever the case may be. Lindholm and whoever he's with, and especially if you've got him with Tkachuk and Mangiapane, I would trust that line in any situation. At any time in a game against any line on the other side. That to me is my dream top line or top all-round line for the Flames. And then you can have Gaudreau and Monahan and somebody else on the right side and boom. People are like, well, what about Taylor Hall? Well, how about you, just for a second, if they were to go down that road, there's a guy you could put with Monahan and Gaudreau, and there is your offensively dominant line with Lindholm's line doing more of the heavy all-round lifting. And if you don't want to talk about Hall, if you think that's pie in the sky, and even I don't know how actually realistic that is, well, then you can plug somebody else there on the right side and still have a really good offensive line. Yuri Hudler at his best ever year playing with those guys. And you can put somebody with Monahan and Gaudreau and they'll still be a good offensive line. Maybe not as good as they are with Lindholm, but still a good offensive line. And if you're playing to their strengths and feeding them lesser opposition and feeding them a ton of offensive zone starts, then I believe they're that much more dangerous as a line.
Well, you even look at the Blues last year with Ryan O'Reilly, right? You need that type of center to win a Stanley Cup. That
exactly
all round.
Every Stanley Cup winner in the modern age of the NHL has essentially had that number one guy, from Kuznetsov and Backstrom to O'Reilly to Crosby to Bergeron to Taves. That is to Kopitar. The teams that win Stanley Cups these days don't necessarily always have the same things, but they always have one thing, and that is the elite number one center that you can count on. I don't think the Flames have that right now with Monahan. I think he is a very good center and an extremely valuable player on a team, but I don't think he's at that level. I think Lindholm could be at that level and could start to broach that conversation down the road.
Yeah, fair, for sure. But now let's get into the goaltending. I'm going to play Kevin Woodley. We had Kevin Woodley on the podcast last week, and he said some interesting things. I just want to get your thoughts on them and kind of where you're at with the Flames goaltending. Here's what Woodley had to say.
Trying, or if he made the switch to a completely different equipment company, or at least we saw signs of him on the internet getting new pads and trying them overseas back home. And this wasn't just a brand switch, which, I mean, hey, it is what it is. Guys switch all the time, but a totally different style of pad. Like, he went from a really soft, flexible pad that I would maybe associate with his style of game to a lot more rigid, structured, like stiff pad. And from the outside, I like both of them, right? Like at In Goal Magazine, we're testing them all. We've done reviews on them all. And they're all really good. Both of these products that we're talking about here are excellent products, but they're very different in terms of what style they would typically.
Yeah, that's a little bit of it. But kind of quickly, what are your thoughts in terms of where Rittich and where are you at with Rittich and Talbot? Where are you? Is this a similar conversation to last year?
Well, but is it not like the conversation, Kev, that is like Kevin Woodley is an absolute encyclopedia on this stuff, and I love. Pinder has him on every once in a while out here in Calgary. I just love sitting back and listening. I don't know anything about goaltending. It's an absolute dark science. Like it is complete and utter voodoo. It's so hard to really understand what makes a goaltender good and how a guy goes from being a fringe goalie in the league to an elite goalie in the league. But this is the conversation that is maybe most from a Flames perspective affected by this pause, because when the pause happened, who is the guy playing better? Cam Talbot. Talbot was the guy that for about 2 months had been the better goaltender of the two. But for the 3.5 months prior, that guy was David Rittich. And David Rittich was an all-star. He was one of the best goalies or better goalies in the Western Conference during the first half of the season. And then it dropped off a little bit. So now enter a 5-month pause. How much can you take from what was happening in February and March, and how much can you apply that to what's going to happen in late July and August when you're still playing the same season? I think that if I were making the decisions as of right now, if I needed to choose a night one starter against the Winnipeg Jets, I'd go David Rittich, because I love the Talbot signing from the get-go. I thought it was a really savvy, low-risk signing. I felt like he was going to have a bounce back year just based on his career, and that was definitely playing out in front of us. He was having a really nice season. But I believe at this point, when David Rittich is at his best and when Cam Talbot is at his best, the margin is slim, but I think Rittich is a little bit like his level's a little bit higher. And so coming off a 5-month break, I think that I would go with Rittich as my night one starter. And I think he'd have a pretty short leash, because my confidence level in Cam Talbot is extremely high, that if Rittich falters and has a bad game one, I wouldn't hesitate going to Cam Talbot in game two, because I'm that confident in Talbot. So I do think that I would give the leg up to Rittich, and I do think that, the tenure and the fact that he's probably still the guy that has the better chance of being the number one goalie for this team down the road, I would go with him for game one. But it's so weird, because all the momentum and all that, there's no position in hockey that is more mano a mano than goaltending. And so all the momentum and all of what was happening leading up to March 12th, the last time there was an NHL game played, kind of goes out the window. You kind of have to base it on this training camp and base it on what you know about these guys. So my guess is that the Flames will go with Rittich in game one and go from there. That's what I would do as well. But that's one of the most fascinating conversations, and one of the convos that I think could go a number of different ways once they're back playing again, because I think the margin between the two guys right now, Kev, is really tiny.
Yeah. And the fascinating thing with this strategy with this too is it's not a 7-game series, it's a 5-game series. No. Which is like, it's not that being down 1 is a bad thing, but being down 2 is worse. So if how you handle the 2 goaltender situation that and how you handle that is going to be so fascinating. And, how quick is that hook? And that's, I think, the question. But, and I'm with you. I think I would probably start with Rittich, and I would have no problem coming back to Talbot. And even if Rittich, even the first 2 games, I wouldn't, maybe this is a little bit outside the box. Even if Rittich won game 1, I wouldn't hesitate to put Talbot in for game 2, especially if you're going back to back, which is a possibility.
And I think especially if you're talking about a not so great performance by Rittich and they find a way to win game 1, I think that's a valid conversation, because I don't think there's a lot separating these two guys right now. And I think there's a very good chance Talbot is back here next season. So in that respect, I don't think that, you're talking about a conversation that's going to go away at the end of the season. So I believe any of the decisions you make are going to be somewhat valid for next season too. So I think that there's no doubt that the Jets, just on paper, with a Vezina Trophy frontrunner in net, have the edge in goal. And if you were to say, hey, whose goaltending do you trust the most between the two sides, you give that edge to Winnipeg. But to your point, like, you have 2 bad games and you are very likely losing a series. And it's not impossible to come back from 0-2. It has happened before. But you're down 0-2 in a best of 5 and a goalie has 2 off nights. Well, next thing you know, you're behind the 8 ball and you're fighting for your lives the rest of the way. So, yeah, it makes that goaltending, the micromanagement of the goaltending makes it that much more important and puts the spotlight on it that much more.
Cool. Well, I know we got to wrap it up here because you are in a hurry. So what have you got going on? You're off. You're back Monday?
Yeah, we're back to normal on Monday. We've been in a pandemic schedule since the middle of March, and we're back to full-on schedule come Monday, July 6th. So I'm looking forward to that. Essentially means that we're live and Calgary focused from 5 a.m. until 6 p.m. That has not been the case during the pandemic. Understandably so, where resources are thin and we're just trying to be smart about things when there's nothing to talk about. Yeah. But yeah, we are back and going full on come July 6th. And training camps, I don't believe they're going to start everything that, I know that people have been reporting this. Larry Brooks had a story about it today. Chris Johnston reported on it earlier this week. And from my understanding, the Flames are planning on July 13th for when their training camp starts. And it might be a little bit later than that. We shall see. But, July 6th, and next thing you know, a week later, training camp starts. Like, let's get at it. This is going to be something we've never covered before. And we're going to be calling games from studios here in Calgary off of TVs, and it's going to be very different. But you know what? Different ain't bad when you're living in an unprecedented, uncharted situation. We're making the best of it, and I'm really looking forward to what the summer has in store and a very bizarre off-season following that.
Yes, it's going to be fascinating. And hey, you never know. We might be talking about a first pick for the Calgary Flames. That's a whole other subject.
That would be one of the most bonkers things that I have ever seen, but it'd be not a bad consolation prize if you end up going out to the Jets.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. But Pat, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. Follow him, Fan960 Steinberg. And we will talk to everyone very soon. Bye for now.